Shalom everyone, and welcome to this episode of Reboot the Root. On this reboot, we are taking a look at what is Passover. Particularly, we are remembering the Passover, which is the title of this teaching. So, join me if you will, as we begin to reboot the Feast of Passover. Shalom. Shalom, and welcome to this episode of Reboot the Root. Thank you for coming back for episode 3, where we're continuing to talk about remembering the Passover. And so if you've joined me for episode 1 and episode 2, you know that we have been talking about some basics of feast keeping and securing our identity as people who should be keeping the feast days. And so if you're new to keeping the feast days, welcome to being a feast keeper. This series of teachings is going to be good for you because we're going to give you the information you need to be familiar with feast keeping. And so we're going to continue on talking about some mechanics of feast keeping, but first we're going to start off with looking at how time works. And so understanding how time works in feast keeping is very important, because we have to know when we're supposed to be somewhere at the right time. So first of all, let's go into the twilight zone, if you will, of feast mechanics, and I'm going to share with you some ideas that maybe stretch and hurt your brain a little bit. Time is dimensional. So we have past, present, future, and a thing called non-time. Non-time. Non-time is that thing that happens outside of time and before time. So there was a time that existed, according to my theory anyway, before creation. And there is a time, I believe, that happens outside or past the time of what we might call eternity. So this is non-time. So these are the 4 dimensions of time: past, present, future, and non-time. And so when we study the feasts and see how they happen, we start to understand that Passover doesn't really happen in the past, but it continues to happen, and it happens in the future as well. Passover is one of those things that occurs in all spatial dimensions of past, present, and future. And I will say non-time, because I think God already ordained this before creation ever happened. And that's the point where it might kind of rattle your cage a little bit. Passover in the past remembers the Exodus. So when we're keeping Passover, we're remembering how God delivered the Israelites from the bondage of slavery from the Egyptians. He was their God who delivered them with a mighty hand, an outstretched hand. He delivered them by the hand of Yahshua. Yahshua was his outstretched hand. It was his arm that he used to deliver the Israelites from their bondage in Egypt. And so in the past, we are remembering what the Exodus meant and how it secured freedom and it released the oppressed. Then we get into the future and we look how Passover remembers what Jesus did as the Passover lamb, that he came to set people free from sin. So if we really look at this, we're seeing that Passover has both a physical and a spiritual level of understanding. And that's true with about just anything in the Bible. There's a physical act that's used to explain a spiritual manifestation. So when we do Passover, especially a Messianic Passover, we would understand that we are remembering the first Passover, which is in Exodus, and then we remember the second Passovers, which are talked about in the Gospels. So we have the old Passover and the new Passover, but the old Passover is still happening within the new Passover. Now try to get your mind around that one. In Yahweh's feasts, we've talked about in our last episode, where a holy day was a day that was set apart by God himself, and man sets up his own set apart days called holidays and put God's name on it. Many mistake the 7 feasts of God for Jewish feasts or feasts of the Jews. So that is not a correct statement to say that there are the feasts of the Jews, because these are God's feasts. Feasts are designed by God for God's people to meet with him. And so let's revisit that verse in Leviticus chapter 23 in verse 2. Speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them concerning the feasts of the Lord. And some people will replace that to say Adonai or even Yahweh. So when we study out all the English translations, Yahweh, Yod He Vav He, and I have that in another teaching called Who is God, we understand that Yahweh has been replaced by capital Lord. And so that is the English contribution to the corruption of the Bible. And it goes on to say, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. And holy convocations is a fancy word that means that we're supposed to have a get-together. We're all supposed to get together and do a lot of convocating. So it's a fancy word to say it's a set-apart meeting. Even these are my feasts. So we see nowhere in the scripture that it says these are Jewish feasts. It says these are God's feasts. And we're remembering the Passover. We're remembering it as a memorial about the first Passover and the second Passover. And if you can get your mind around this, the first Passover was happening as the second Passover was happening, and the second Passover is happening while the first Passover is happening, because time is really cylindrical. It's reoccurring. It's a big loop. And so if you can see in your mind this circle or a loop with different points of time on it, ultimately when the circle is spinning and spinning around, each of those points of time will ultimately meet up with each other. And so that's why time is a kind of a rotating loop where they all meet each other at some point or another. And so when we are remembering the Passover, we are recalling, we are recounting, we are commemorating what God has done for us by setting us free, whether it be physical or spiritual or even both. The feasts look back and they also look ahead. The feasts, like I said, are repetitive, being sort of like a cylindrical representation of time. Passover remembers and retells the story of deliverance and the Exodus. So when we have a Passover meal, part of what we do is that we will retell the Exodus story. So we will talk about how God used Moses to approach Pharaoh to let his people go, and that God delivered a series of, well, actually 10 of them, a series of 10 plagues to convince the Pharaoh to let his people go. And so we will retell that story at the Passover meal. Passover and will incorporate the 4 dimensions of time: past, present, future, and out of time, which can be pre-time and past time. The appointed times will be the feasts of Yahweh. These are the things that God has preordained. I believe that God preordained them before creation to set up appointed times, because doesn't God know everything? Do you think anything that happens to mankind is a surprise to him? He always has a plan of how everything is going to happen, and that's no different with designing the feast. God, I believe, designed them from the beginning of time. In fact, I think we might be able to see some instances in the Old Testament before Exodus that we can probably see some elements of this might have actually been a feast. So one example of that would be is like Cain and Abel. When Cain was giving his attempt of worshiping God with his sacrifice of produce versus his brother Abel, his sacrifice of meat, this could have been possible. I'm not saying it was, but it could have been Yom Kippur, possibly. Or it could have been first fruits or something like that, but I would tend to think it's more like Yom Kippur. The signs of creation are of these feast days. We see them evident when we look at the creation story in Genesis chapter 1, that we see that on the 4th day of creation, that these signs of creation were created to determine the appointed time for the feasts, and this would be the creation of the sun and moon on the 4th day. And so if we go to Genesis chapter 1, we read that God created the sun and the moon and the stars for signs and seasons and appointed times. And so we can go back to Genesis chapter 1 and we can read about that, about to say, I think God is creating, God has already set apart the appointed times before he even did creation. So these appointed times would be called the Moedim, which we've already talked about, that these are the Moedim of God, the appointed times. And the feast days in Hebrew, they are also called Hagim, which would be plural for Hag. We would add another word, which is Hasamaic, Samaic. So Samaic would mean like happy. So when we're saying happy Passover, we would say Hag Samaic Pesach, which means happy feast of Passover. The feasts of Yahweh, which we've already said before, are not of the Jews, nor of they of man. A man, I don't think, could create the elements and the intricity of the feasts and what they mean, what they do for man, and what the theological implications of the feasts are. Man couldn't do these things, only God could do them. So if you've never kept the feasts before and you've always been party to holidays of man, we tend to follow a calendar that we have on our walls that tell us this is when it's going to be every year. Well, that's not how it works in God's calendar. So I have another teaching called Time, the Creator's Calendar. Well, we'll talk about this more in depthly. So I'm just going to give you a little brief rundown about how this calendar of God works. So we have to know, when are we keeping these feast days? When are we supposed to keep Passover? So this is going to be very new for some of you who have never kept what is called the Hebrew calendar or the Creator's calendar. And so it works like this. The Hebrew calendar works by looking at the elements of creation, which is the moon and the sun. So we look to the sun to tell us when the day has come and when the day is gone. And so the Bible teaches that each day starts by the sunset of each day. So when the sun goes down, the old day ends and the next day begins. And then we look at the moon cycle to tell us when the new month starts. So a new month starts when the new moon has arrived. And so if you go to my other teaching about it's called Time, the Creator's Calendar, I teach you about when is the new moon. And so there are different ideas of people who have their own calendars that will talk about when they think the new moon is. And so whatever belief you have of when the new moon is or new month is, it's all based upon when the new moon arrives. So let me put this in more perspective, is that the moon will set the advent of the months. The moon tells us when the new month has arrived. And the sun sets the limit of the day. What time will the day begin the feast? In other words, we need to know what time do we do the feasts and what time do the feasts end. We need to know that, especially when we're planning for work. When we tell our employers they need to have these days off, we need to know we're not talking about when the sun rises. We're not talking about midnight, but we're talking about when the sun goes down. And so we need to know these mechanics in order to keep the feasts, and they're going to be very different for us who have never kept a Creator's calendar, because the Creator's calendar is all about creation. We're using the elements of creation to tell us when the new moon gets here. And we need to know that when the Bible talks about the first month, it talks about the seventh month, we're not talking about a relationship to a Gregorian calendar, because the first month of Gregorian calendar would be January, and the seventh month would be July, and that's not when the feasts happen. The feasts happen according to when the new moon gets here. We know that a new month has also gotten here. So the Hebrew calendar, as I said before, is also known as a creation or a Creator's calendar. And because we have a monthly calendar that works within a yearly calendar, we automatically get confused, or what I'll say, confused, is because we think that we're not used to having more than one calendar happen at a time, but we do. And so we have a Gregorian calendar that goes from January to December. That's one calendar. Then we may have a school calendar that happens within that. Then we might have another calendar that happens. We have all kinds of calendars that are happening all at the same time. And this is what we have here. So we have a monthly calendar working inside of a yearly calendar. So we're establishing when the month calendar starts, which in the Bible it is called the beginning of months, and that starts when the barley is Abib in Israel. So when we see in Israel that the barley has been sighted and that it is green in the ears, then we know that the beginning of months has started. We can also calculate it to some degree by using some modern day programs and using our calendars to kind of anticipate in a general area when it will happen. So the Hebrew calendar is also known as the Creator's calendar or a creation calendar. Two calendars working within one another at the same time, all based upon a luni-solar calendar, which means we're using the moon and the sun to determine our calendar, whereas the annual feasts begin with the thing called the beginning of months, and that is in Exodus, and that we see that. And in Hebrew, that is called the Tahalit Asodim, which is called the beginning of months. And so we see that in Exodus, it says, "This shall be the beginning of months to you." And it's talking about when something is Abib, and we generally understand that as to be the barley is Abib, and that starts the beginning of months. And when we know the beginning of months established by the barley harvest and by the new moon. So when we know that the barley is Abib, we look to see when the next new moon is, and that will be the first month. And then for Passover, what we would do is when we know when the first day of the new moon is at the barley Abib, then we would count 14 days from the first of the month to know when Passover is. Further understanding what the requirements of feast keeping would be, we look to Deuteronomy chapter 16 that talks about that there were 3 times a year that all the males would be required to go to Jerusalem to keep the feasts. So I'm going to read this verse in Deuteronomy 16, and then I'm going to give you something interesting to think about. Deuteronomy 16, verse 16 says, 3 times a year all of your males shall appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, at the feast of unleavened bread, at the feast of weeks, and at the feast of booths. They shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. So recap, the 3 feasts that the men were required to go to in Jerusalem. And so whenever in the Bible you see it says, the Lord your God at the place he will choose, that usually is referring to Jerusalem. So these are unleavened bread, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And so 3 times a year is the Lord's Moedim. We have the 3 seasons of spring, summer, and fall. They're representing all the feasts contained within the monthly cycle. So the interesting thing about it is, if we look at this verse in Deuteronomy 16:16, is that there is 3 times a year the males were required to appear before God at Jerusalem. So these were unleavened bread, Shavuot, and Sukkot. So what's interesting is these cover the 3 seasons of feasts. So at unleavened bread, you would be keeping not only unleavened bread, but Passover and first fruits, because they all happen close together. No one would leave unleavened bread, go back to their house, and then come back within a few days and come back and do the first fruits again. You would do them all together while you're there. Then you would come back in the summertime for Shavuot and then go back home. And then you would come back to Jerusalem to keep not only Sukkot, but you would keep Yom Kippur, and you would keep the Feast of Trumpets. So this is, I believe, this is why that the men were going 3 times a year, is you don't want to have all this time of going back and forth. You would just stay there for a season until those feasts were done. So 3 times of the year is the Lord's Moedim, represented in spring, summer, and fall, where spring would cover the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Passover, and unleavened bread, and first fruits. So the first fruits would be an offering of barley, whereas when they come back for summer, for Shavuot, that would be the first fruits of the wheat harvest. And then they would come back for Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, and Sukkot, or Feast of Trumpets, for the first fruits of the fruit harvest. So we have 3 different types of first fruit harvests. We have a barley, we have a wheat, and then we have a fruit. And these 3 times of feasts are based upon the harvests of the barley, wheat, and fruit, as I just mentioned. So as I was sharing before, it's interesting and important to know what the feast times are. We talked about how the new moon establishes the new month. So you first have to understand what your belief of when a new moon is. So there are lots of cycles to the moon. So let's talk about a few of them. We have the dark phase of the moon, which is the moon conjunction, and that simply means that the earth, moon, and sun are in direct parallel alignment with each other. So you would not see the moon lit up, it would be completely dark. And so that's a moon conjunction. The next one to consider would be the first phase of the moon that you would see, well, the visible sign anyway, which is called the sliver or the crescent moon. Okay, so I would say the majority of people who are called feast keepers would keep this understanding of when a new moon is by the sliver. Then what you have is you have the different quarters of the moon, the first, second, third, and fourth quarter. actually it'd be 2 quarters. There'd be the first quarter and the second quarter, and then you would have the full moon. And there are a few people out there who believe that is the new moon. A very select and minute population of people believe that. So, so you have the moon conjunction, you have the crescent cycle, you have the different quarters, and then you have the full moon, and then you start over again with the dark moon cycle. And so you would determine what do you feel that the new moon cycle is to determine when you get to the first month, the second month, the third month, so on. And so this new moon establishes when a new month becomes. The first day begins at sunset, and it would also end at sunset. And we look to creation to tell us how do all these things work. We can study this initially in Genesis chapter 1, but then we move on with the rest of the Bible to find out what does the Bible teach about the Creator's calendar. Creation will show the elements of timekeeping where we see them in days, weeks, months, and years. So this is a good place to end this episode 3 of Remembering Passover. I hope you've enjoyed what we've talked about thus far. I know that if this is new to you, then it's new to you. It's very overwhelming. There's a lot of things to look into. There's a lot of things to consider. It's a big old journey. We don't all start off knowing everything, but it's a little bit at a time. It's kind of like going to a buffet. We try a little bit of things and we figure out what is true and what is not true. But we have to kind of cover a lot of ground because feast keeping is one of those major things of the life of a person of Hebrew roots. You have to understand what you believe and what you don't believe, because there's a lot of people out there who've got their own theologies, a lot of different doctrines that may or may not match up with the Bible, but it's your job as a student of the Bible to figure out what things are true and what things are not. Well, anyway, for now, thank you for joining me for this episode 3, and invite you back for episode 4, where we will continue to look at Passover. Shalom.